Elena Pike thought she was just hiring a man to clean out her old barn. She thought it was a simple transaction, a few dollars for a few days' work, a way to finally deal with the one part of the farm that had remained frozen in time since her husband's death. She never, in a million years, expected to find him in the hayloft, raising two motherless babies all by himself. And she certainly never expected that this discovery would unravel a secret that would tear her quiet life, her peaceful town, and the memory of her perfect marriage completely apart. For 3 long years, the 54-year-old widow had lived with a silence that was deafening. After Henry died, the big farmhouse on the edge of Dusty Fork, Texas, had become an echo chamber of memories. The floors creaked with the ghosts of his footsteps. The kitchen table felt impossibly large, set for one. She'd catch herself making 2 cups of coffee in the morning, her hands moving on autopilot, before the brutal reality crashed down on her all over again. Henry wasn't coming in from the fields. He wasn't going to be there, smelling of hay and sunshine, his calloused hands reaching for hers. He was gone, and the silence he left behind was a physical weight, pressing down on her chest day after day. So when she rode her old mare out to the barn to pay the handyman, Jasper Malloy, she was just looking for an end to the day. A transaction. Instead, she found the weathered rancher kneeling on the floor of the loft by the dim, flickering light of a single kerosene lantern. He wasn't fixing the rotten floorboards she'd hired him for. He was spoon-feeding applesauce to 2 identical toddlers, 2 tiny boys with hair the color of corn silk and eyes that held a sorrow far too deep for their age. He offered her a shy, embarrassed apology for the mess, for the makeshift nursery he'd built in the shadows of her barn. But Elena didn't see a mess. As she looked at this broken man and his 2 motherless children, she felt a warmth spread through her chest, a forgotten flicker of life in a heart she thought had turned to stone. It looked like a simple story. 2 grieving souls, a lonely widow and a burdened father, finding each other in the most unexpected of places. But that wasn't the story at all. What was happening in her barn wasn't a coincidence. It wasn't a chance encounter. It was the final move in a long, tragic game that had started years ago. And the man she thought was named Jasper Malloy was not who he said he was. Not even close. The morning sun cast long, unforgiving shadows across the main street of Dusty Fork. It was a town so small you could blink and miss it, a wide spot in the road where secrets were currency, and everyone knew your business before you did. Elena stood at her kitchen window, the same window she'd stood at for 27 years. Her fingers worried the loose gold band on her left hand, a nervous habit she'd picked up after Henry's funeral. The ring was a constant reminder of the life they were supposed to have. The Pike farm was the last bastion of civilization before the Texas prairie swallowed the horizon. The white clapboard farmhouse had been in Henry's family for 4 generations. Pike men had been born here, worked this land, and died here. Now, she was the last Pike left, and only by marriage. She'd been Elena Hartwell once, a bright-eyed schoolteacher from Dallas who came to Dusty Fork for a 1-year contract. That 1 year turned into a lifetime the night she met Henry Pike at the church social. He was a gentle giant of a man, 6'4" of quiet strength and surprising grace. He didn't say much, but when he looked at you with those steady blue eyes, you felt like the only person in the world. When he asked her to marry him 6 months later, kneeling in the very barn that now stood derelict and decaying, she'd said yes, without a second thought. They'd painted the nursery a cheerful yellow. They'd picked out names. William for a boy after Henry's father. Rose for a girl after her own mother. They dreamed of filling the silent farmhouse with the sound of children's laughter. But the children never came. Year after year passed in a blur of hope and disappointment. Doctors in Dallas offered sterile condolences and complicated explanations, but the end result was always the same. The nursery remained empty. The silence in the house grew louder. Henry never blamed her. He'd hold her through the nights she cried herself to sleep, whispering that she was enough, that she was all he'd ever need. and she had tried to believe him. At 54, she had mostly made her peace with it. She'd mothered half the children in town during her years of teaching, and she told herself that had to be enough. It wasn't. But she was good at lying to herself. The barn had been Henry's sanctuary. He spent more time in that weathered structure than he did in the house, mending fences, tending horses, dreaming of a future that was stolen from them both. She hadn't set foot in it since the day he died. He'd kissed her goodbye that morning, same as any other. Promised he'd be in for lunch. He'd walked out to the barn to fix a loose board in the loft. A massive heart attack, the doctor said. Instant. He didn't suffer. She was the one who suffered. She found him when he didn't come in for his sandwich, lying there on the dusty floor, looking like he was just taking a nap. For 3 years, that broken board in the loft remained untouched, a monument to the exact second her world had ended. But the neglect was becoming a danger. The roof was sagging, the walls groaning. The whole structure threatened to collapse, and with it, the last tangible piece of Henry she had left. That's when her friend Martha Caldwell, who ran the town diner and the town gossip mill, had mentioned the new guy. That Jasper Malloy, Martha had whispered conspiratorially after church service. He's been asking around for handyman work, poor man. It's been a rough go for him since his wife passed away. Elelanina had heard the stories. The outsider from up north, Montana or somewhere, who'd bought the old Henderson place a couple years back. Arrived with a pregnant wife and big dreams. Then, as it so often does in a place like Dusty Fork, tragedy struck. The twins were born during the worst blizzard the county had seen in 50 years. The roads were impassable. By the time the doctor made it out to the Henderson farm, Jax's wife, Sarah, was gone. She'd bled out bringing their sons into the world. He was left with a broken heart, a mortgaged farm, and 2 tiny, screaming babies. The town had rallied, of course. Casseroles and knitted booties flooded the Malloy house for a few weeks. But casseroles run out. Life moves on. Jax Malloy became just another sad story, another widower with haunted eyes. Elelanena had seen him at the feed store, a tall man who carried his grief like a heavy coat, even in the Texas heat. He kept to himself, and she respected that. She knew what it was like to want to be left alone with your ghosts. But now she needed help, and he needed work. It was a practical solution to a practical problem. Or so she thought. She drove her dusty pickup out to his place, the tires crunching on the gravel road. The Henderson farm was smaller than hers, the paint peeling on the little 2-story house. But the yard was neat, and someone had planted flowers in the window boxes, a hopeful splash of color against the faded wood. He was in the corral, working a young colt, moving with a quiet patience that reminded her so much of Henry it made her chest ache. He was lean and strong, with dark hair threaded with silver at the temples, though he couldn't be much older than 40. When he saw her truck, he calmed the horse and walked over, pulling off his worn leather gloves. Up close, she could see the grief carved into the lines around his gray eyes. They were the eyes of a man who had seen too much. "Mrs. Pike," he said, his voice a low baritone with an accent she couldn't quite place. "Martha Caldwell said you might have some work." She explained about the barn, about the loft, about the 3 years of neglect. He listened intently, his gaze thoughtful. "I can take a look," he said. "Sounds like it might need more than just a few boards, but I can do the work. I have to work around my boys." The boys, she'd forgotten about the twins. In her mind, they were still the tragic infants from the story, but 2 years had passed. "How old are they now?" she asked. A flicker of something, pride, love, pain, crossed his face. 2.5. Getting to be a handful. He explained that a neighbor usually watched them, but he couldn't be gone for too long at a time. They agreed on a fair price. His handshake was firm, his palm rough and calloused. For a fleeting second, she felt a strange flutter in her stomach, a spark in a place she thought had long gone cold. She dismissed it as nerves. It had been a long time since a man other than the pastor or the mailman, had stood on her property. "I can start tomorrow," he said. "Early." The next morning, Elena found herself buzzing with an unfamiliar energy. She made extra coffee. She made a plate of thick-cut bacon and egg sandwiches. It was just neighborly courtesy, she told herself. Nothing more. At 7 o'clock sharp, the rumble of his old Ford truck echoed in the drive. She watched from the window as he climbed out, moving with an easy confidence. She smoothed down her simple cotton dress, suddenly feeling self-conscious. "Morning, Mrs. Pike," he said, tipping the brim of his dusty cowboy hat. "Please call me Elena," she insisted, handing him a thermos of the hot coffee. "And I made these for your lunch." The surprise in his eyes was genuine. That's very kind of you, Elena." The way her name sounded in his low voice, careful and respectful, did that funny thing to her stomach again. She walked him to the barn. The sight of it, even worse than she'd remembered, sent a fresh wave of guilt through her. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The air inside was thick with the smell of decay and disuse. "It's going to take some time," Jack said, his voice gentle as he surveyed the damage. "But the bones are still good. It's not beyond saving." His words seemed to hang in the air, meaning more than just wood and nails. She wasn't sure if they were talking about the barn anymore. She left him to his work, but the house felt different now. It was no longer just her silent sanctuary. There was a presence on her land. The rhythmic sound of his hammer from the barn was a strange comfort, a pulse of life where there had been none. Late in the afternoon, she wrote out a check for the first day's labor and decided to take it to him. It was only polite. She'd check on his progress, remind him about the sandwiches. It was a simple errand. The big barn door was ajar, and the hammering had stopped. A faint golden light spilled from the open hayloft door above. "Mr. Malloy?" she called out, her voice echoing in the vast, empty space. "Jax, I have your payment for the day." A beat of silence. Then she heard it. A soft, gurgling sound. A baby's babble. It definitely wasn't coming from a grown man. Confusion prickled her skin. She looked up at the loft, her heart starting to beat a little faster. "Just a minute." Jax's voice came from above, but it was strained, tight with an emotion she couldn't identify. Embarrassment? Panic? "I'll be right down!" But Elena didn't wait. A strange, powerful curiosity propelled her forward. She placed her foot on the bottom rung of the old wooden ladder leading to the loft. It was Henry's ladder. She hadn't touched it in 3 years. Now, she climbed. With each step, the babbling sound grew clearer. She reached the top, pulled herself onto the loft floor, and her breath caught in her throat. Her world tilted on its axis. The scene before her was lit by the soft, warm glow of a single kerosene lantern. In a small area swept clean of dust and debris, an old quilt was spread over the hay. And on that quilt, kneeling on the floor, was Jasper Malloy. He wasn't holding a hammer. He was holding a tiny spoon. And sitting in front of him, their faces smeared with applesauce, were 2 of the most beautiful children she had ever seen. One was in a faded blue shirt, the other in tiny overalls. They had the same dark, serious eyes as their father, and a shock of blonde hair so pale it looked white in the lantern light. They were perfect. "Oh my," Elena whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. Jax's face flushed a deep, painful red. He scrambled to his feet, nearly knocking over the jar of baby food. "Mrs. Pike, Elena, I am so sorry. I know this looks... I can explain everything." But Elena couldn't process his words. She was frozen, staring at this impossible, heartbreakingly beautiful scene. A makeshift home carved out of the heart of her grief. A father's desperate love, hidden away in the shadows. One of the twins, the one in the overalls, toddled over to her on unsteady legs. He looked up at her with wide, curious eyes and babbled something soft. Then he pointed a sticky finger at her and said a word that shattered the 3 years of silence in her heart. "Mama?" The word, spoken in a voice as clear and sweet as a tiny bell, struck Elena like a physical blow. She gripped the edge of the loft to steady herself, the wood biting into her palm. Her vision swam. For a wild, insane moment, she felt like she was going to faint. These are my boys," Jack stammered, his voice thick with mortification. He rushed forward, scooping the child up. "Luke and Liam. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, she usually watches them, but her granddaughter is getting married today. I didn't have anyone else, and I really, really needed this job." His words were a torrent, a desperate attempt to explain the inexplicable. I thought I could keep them quiet up here. Let them nap while I worked. I am so sorry. I should have told you from the start. I'll pack them up right now. We'll leave." Elena finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "You're living here? In my barn?" "No, God, no," he said, shaking his head vehemently. "We live at the old Henderson place. It's a 40-minute drive each way. And with the boys." He gestured helplessly at the twins. The other one, Luke, had crawled over and was now tugging on the hem of her dress. "I just set up this little spot so they'd be safe while I was working on the roof. I can have it cleared out in 5 minutes." Luke pulled himself up using her leg for support, his little hands surprisingly strong. He looked up at her, not with fear, but with an open, trusting curiosity. Without thinking, Elena sank to her knees on the dusty floorboards. "Hello there," she said softly. The little boy beamed, a gap-toothed grin that melted something deep inside her. "That's Luke," Jack said, his voice softening. "He's the adventurer, always the first one into trouble." Elena reached out a hesitant hand and stroked Luke's silky blonde hair. He leaned into her touch. The other twin, Liam, the one who had called her mama, waddled over and plopped himself right into her lap, as if he'd been doing it his whole life. He was warm and solid, a comforting weight she hadn't realized she'd been missing. "And this is Liam," Jack said, a note of wonder in his voice as he watched his normally shy son make himself at home with a complete stranger. "He's the quiet one, the observer." Elena looked from one cherubic face to the other. These boys, they were the age her own children would have been. They were the ghost of a dream she had buried long ago. And seeing them here, in this place so saturated with Henry's memory, felt like a message from another world. It was beautiful, and it was excruciating. "How old did you say they are?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. 2.5. Their birthday was last month. July. The same month Henry had died. The coincidence was a punch to the gut. She had to blink back the sudden sting of tears. Liam, settled comfortably in her lap, began to play with the small silver locket that hung around her neck. It had been a gift from Henry on their first anniversary. Inside was a tiny photo of the two of them, young and smiling on their wedding day. "Pretty," Liam said, his little finger tracing the engraved flowers on the silver. The sound of his voice, so clear and certain, sent another shock through her. "He talks?" A ghost of a smile touched Jax's lips. It was the first real smile she'd seen on his face, and it transformed his weary features. "They both do." Luke's first word was no, which should tell you everything. Liam's was daddy. There was a universe of pride and love in his voice, the kind of pride that only a father could feel. She looked at this man, this stranger who had built a secret world for his children in the ruins of her own. She saw the exhaustion etched into his face, the sheer, bone-deep weariness of a man carrying an impossible burden alone. She thought of her own empty days, of the crushing silence of her big, lonely house. She had a surplus of everything he lacked: time, space, quiet. He was drowning in purpose, and she was adrift without one. "How do you manage?" she asked, the question filled with a genuine, aching curiosity. "All of this, by yourself?" The smile vanished from Jax's face, replaced by that familiar, haunted expression. "Some days are better than others. My wife, Sarah, she was supposed to be here for this. She had it all planned out. She was going to teach them to be good men." His voice cracked on the last words, and he looked away, staring into the dark corners of the loft. I'm doing my best, but most days, I feel like I'm failing them. They deserve more than a father who has to sneak them onto a job site. Liam had snuggled against her chest, his breathing evening out as he began to drift off to sleep. Luke, meanwhile, had discovered her purse and was attempting to pry it open with the focused determination of a safecracker. Elelena gently took the purse away, earning a small, indignant huff from the little boy. And in that moment, an idea bloomed in her mind. A wild, reckless, terrifying idea. I could watch them, she heard herself say. The words hung in the dusty air between them. Jack stared at her as if she'd just started speaking a foreign language. Heat flooded her cheeks. I mean, while you're working, if you need someone. We don't know each other, but I was a teacher for 15 years. I'm good with children, and... She looked down at the sleeping boy in her arms, his small fist curled around her locket. And I have nothing but time. I couldn't ask you to do that, he stammered. You're not asking, she said, her voice firmer now, more certain. I'm offering. Bring them to the house. It's cool and it's safe. You could focus on your work without worrying. It seems practical. Jax was silent for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face, trying to understand, trying to see the catch. People in Dusty Fork didn't do things for free. Not usually. I don't know, he said finally, running a hand through his hair. I can't pay you anything extra. I don't want your money, she said, and was surprised by how true it was. She looked down at Liam's angelic face, at Luke, who was now trying to climb his father's leg like a tree. Honestly, she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper, I think it might help me too. Something in his expression shifted. The wall of defensiveness and exhaustion seemed to crumble, just a little. A flicker of hope appeared in his tired eyes. Are you sure? They're a handful. They get into everything. We'll take it slow, Elelena said, a plan already forming in her mind. Just for a few hours, see how it goes. I have some old toys in the attic, from my teaching days. I can make them a proper lunch. The offer felt momentous, a turning point. She held her breath, suddenly terrified he would say no, that this brief, impossible vision of life in her house would vanish as quickly as it had appeared. Okay, Jack said quietly, his voice rough with an emotion he couldn't hide. Okay, if you're really sure. I'm sure, she said, and she meant it more than anything she had said in 3 years. As she carefully stood up, the sleeping weight of Liam, a precious burden in her arms, her eyes fell on the silver locket still clutched in his tiny hand, the locket with the picture of her and Henry, a symbol of a dream that had died. But as she looked from the locket to the child in her arms, a new thought took root. Maybe some dreams don't die. Maybe they just find a different way to come home. But as she carried the boy down the ladder and into the light, she didn't see the other object clutched in his fist, something he'd picked up from the dusty floor of the loft. A small, tarnished brass key. A key she had never seen before in her life. Walking into her own kitchen with a child in her arms felt like stepping into an alternate reality. The room, which had felt so cavernous and empty for years, suddenly seemed right-sized. Perfect. Liam remained asleep against her shoulder, while Luke, whom Jax carried, looked around with wide, curious eyes, taking in every detail of the unfamiliar space. Well now, Elelena said, her voice unnaturally bright. Let's see what we can find for you two to do. She gently settled Liam into one of the sturdy oak chairs at the table Henry had built, boxing him in with another chair to be safe. The house was a minefield of potential hazards for a curious toddler, a fact she hadn't considered in decades. She found the old wooden crate in the back of the pantry, tucked away behind dusty jars of preserves. It was filled with the tools of her former trade, colorful wooden blocks, well-loved picture books, and sturdy puzzles. She'd kept them for reasons she couldn't articulate, telling herself they were mementos. Now, she knew the truth. She'd been waiting. She set the crate on the table, and Luke's eyes lit up. He scrambled onto a chair and immediately began to investigate, his small hands pulling out the blocks. Soon, both boys, with Liam now awake and joining in, were engrossed in building wobbly towers that would collapse in a shower of wood, sending them into peals of delighted laughter. The sound, oh, the sound of it, children's laughter echoing off her kitchen walls. It was a melody she had only ever heard in her dreams. It was so beautiful it hurt, a sharp, sweet pain that lanced through the scar tissue around her heart. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to regulate her breathing. This was what had been missing. It was so obvious now, so painfully clear. For the next hour, she lost herself in their world. She helped them build, read them a story about a runaway bunny, and marveled at their small, perfect interactions. They were good boys, gentle with each other. When Luke accidentally knocked over Liam's tower, he looked genuinely concerned and immediately helped his brother rebuild. There was a kindness in them that spoke of a loving hand, even in the midst of tragedy. But she also saw the shadows. Liam would periodically look toward the back door, a hopeful, expectant expression on his face, as if waiting for someone else to walk in. And Luke had a habit of reaching out and just touching her hand, his fingers lingering, a silent plea for contact, for reassurance. They were missing their mother in 1,000 tiny ways they couldn't name. Just before noon, the sound of Jax's work boots on the back porch sent a jolt through the room. The boys' heads snapped up, their faces alight with pure, unadulterated joy. "Daddy!" Luke shrieked, scrambling down from his chair and making a beeline for the door. Jax appeared in the doorway, his shirt soaked with sweat, sawdust clinging to his dark hair. His gaze went straight to his sons, a silent, anxious checklist. Are they safe? Are they happy? How'd they do? He asked her, but his eyes never left the boys, who were now clinging to his legs. They were angels, Elenina said truthfully. Absolute perfection. Jax raised a skeptical eyebrow. Angels, are you sure we're talking about my kids? He knelt down to their level. Luke, you behave for Mrs. Elenina. Blocks, Luke announced proudly, as if this explained everything. Liam helped me, Elenina added, and then the endearment slipped out, as natural as breathing. Didn't you, sweetheart? Liam beamed at her, and she felt her cheeks flush. She risked a glance at Jax. He was watching her, his expression unreadable, his gray eyes intense. I brought sandwiches, he said, breaking the strange spell. Figured they'd be hungry. Actually, she said, gesturing toward the stove where a pot was simmering gently, I made soup, for all of us. I hope you don't mind. I had the ingredients. The look of stunned surprise on his face was almost comical. You made lunch? Just chicken noodle and some cornbread, she said quickly, suddenly worried she'd overstepped, that she'd presumed too much. It's nothing fancy. He sank into a chair at the table, pulling Luke onto his lap. He looked from the steaming pot on the stove to the two boys babbling at the table, and then to her. His voice was rough with an emotion he was trying to swallow. When, he said slowly, was the last time somebody cooked a meal for us? The quiet, raw vulnerability of the question stole her breath. When, she replied softly, was the last time I cooked for anyone but myself? They ate together at the big oak table, a makeshift family of strangers. The boys were messy and loud, and the kitchen, for the first time in years, felt alive. It felt like a home. Jax ate 2 full bowls of the soup, his praise genuine and heartfelt. This is really good, he said between spoonfuls. The boys don't get a lot of home cooking. I'm not much of a chef. I enjoy it, she confessed. I just haven't had a reason to for a long time. The simple statement hung in the air, laden with the weight of 1,000 solitary meals eaten in silence. After they finished, as Elenina was clearing the plates, Liam toddled over to her. He held up his small, clenched fist. Found, he said, and opened his hand. In his sticky palm lay the small tarnished brass key she'd glimpsed earlier. "Oh, what's this, sweetie?" she asked, taking it from him. It was an old key, ornate and unusual. It wasn't for any lock in her house. She was sure of it. "Where did you find this?" Liam pointed vaguely. "Barn, floor." Jax looked over, his face suddenly tense. "What is it?" "Just an old key," she said, holding it up. "Liam found it in the loft." Jax's eyes fixed on the key. The color seemed to drain from his face. For a split second, an expression she could only describe as pure panic flashed across his features before he masked it. "Huh. Must have fallen out of an old trunk or something," he said, his voice a little too casual. He reached out. "Here, I'll get rid of it. Probably junk." He took the key from her, his fingers closing around it tightly. But Elena had seen his reaction. It wasn't the reaction of a man looking at a piece of junk. It was the reaction of a man who had just had his deepest secret held up to the light. She didn't know what the key unlocked, but she knew, with a sudden, chilling certainty, that it was something he never wanted her to find. The days settled into a new, unfamiliar rhythm. Each morning, Jax would arrive with the boys, his truck rumbling down the long driveway just after sunrise. He would hand them over, his eyes always holding a question. "Are you sure about this?" And she would answer with a reassuring smile. He would then disappear into the cavernous barn, and the sounds of hammering and sawing would become the soundtrack to her days. And her house, her silent, empty house, would come alive. Luke and Liam were a whirlwind of joyous energy. They rediscovered every corner of her home. The living room became a racetrack for toy trucks. The back porch became a fort built from blankets and chairs. They splashed in the big clawfoot tub, filling the bathroom with steam and shrieks of laughter. Elena felt like she was waking up from a long, gray dream. She baked cookies, patched tiny holes in the knees of their overalls, and kissed scraped elbows. She read them stories in the big armchair where Henry used to sit, their warm little bodies nestled against hers. She was mothering. After all these years, she was finally mothering. And it felt more right, more natural than anything she had ever done. She and Jax maintained a polite, careful distance. They had their lunch together every day at the kitchen table, a silent truce in the middle of the day. They talked about the weather, the price of feed, the progress on the barn. They never talked about his wife. They never talked about her husband. They never talked about the strange, unspoken thing that was growing between them, this fragile dependency that felt both comforting and terrifying. But the image of his face when he saw that key was burned into her memory. She started watching him more closely. She noticed how his eyes would sometimes drift to the framed photo of her and Henry on the mantelpiece. His expression unreadable, almost resentful. She noticed how he never ever talked about his past, about where he was from up north, or about his wife Sarah. Whenever the subject got close, he would deftly change it, his voice becoming clipped and distant. One afternoon, a week into their new arrangement, she was folding laundry in the living room while the boys napped upstairs. She picked up a small pair of denim overalls, and a wave of pure, uncomplicated happiness washed over her. Then she saw it. Stitched onto the inside of the waistband was a small white name tag, the kind mothers use for summer camp. It was faded and worn, but the name was still legible, written in neat cursive letters. The name wasn't Malloy. It was Walker. Liam Walker. Elena stared at the name, her blood turning to ice. Walker. Not Malloy. Why would the name tag say Walker? Her mind raced. Maybe it was his mother's maiden name. A simple explanation. Of course. That had to be it. She tried to dismiss it, to fold the overalls and put the thought away. But she couldn't. It was a splinter under her skin, a dissonant note in the beautiful new song of her life. Later that day, as Jax was packing up the boys to leave, she tried to ask about it, keeping her voice as casual as she could. "I noticed the name tags in some of the boys' clothes," she said, her back to him as she wiped down the counter. Walker. Was that Sarah's maiden name? It's a lovely name. There was a dead silence behind her. She could feel his stillness. She turned around. Jax was frozen in the act of buttoning Liam's jacket. His face was a pale, tight mask. The friendly, hard-working handyman was gone. In his place was a stranger with cold, guarded eyes. "Yes," he said, his voice flat and hard. "It was." "Oh," she said, trying to smile. "That's nice. A way of remembering her." "Something like that," he said curtly. He hoisted Liam onto his hip and grabbed Luke's hand. He didn't say goodbye. He just turned and walked out the door, leaving Elena standing alone in her suddenly silent kitchen. The air was thick with his lie. She didn't know how she knew, but she knew. He was lying. That night she couldn't sleep. The name Walker echoed in her mind. Walker. Why did it sound so familiar? She got out of bed, the floorboards creaking under her feet. In the bottom drawer of her dresser, beneath stacks of old linens, was a box of Henry's things she could never bring herself to throw away. His old wallet, his favorite pocket knife, a stack of letters from his time in the army, and his day planners. Henry had been a meticulous man. He kept a detailed planner every year, jotting down appointments, calving dates, reminders. She pulled out the planner from 3 years ago, the year he died. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Flipping through the pages was like traveling back in time. Fix fence post, pasture 4, order seed, pick up Eleanor's prescription. She flipped to July, the month he died. The first 2 weeks were filled with his neat, blocky handwriting. And then, on July 15th, the day he died, there was a single entry. An entry she had never noticed before, had never had a reason to look for. 2 p.m. S. Walker. Miller's Creek Bridge. S. Walker. Her breath hitched. S. As in Sarah? Miller's Creek Bridge was a secluded spot 20 miles out of town. A place people went when they didn't want to be seen. Her Henry, her faithful, gentle Henry, had a secret meeting scheduled on the day he died. With a woman named S. Walker. And now, a man claiming his dead wife's maiden name was Walker, was living on the edge of town, raising 2 children who looked nothing like him, and lying to her face. Elena sank onto the floor, the planner falling from her hands. The beautiful, simple story of 2 broken souls finding comfort in each other dissolved into something ugly and terrifying. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a reckoning, and it was happening right under her roof. The next morning, Elena felt like a spy in her own home. When Jax arrived, she greeted him with a smile that felt brittle and fake. She took the boys, her heart twisting with a toxic cocktail of love for them and a growing fear of their father. What was his game? Was he after the farm? Henry's money? There wasn't much, but to a struggling man it might seem like a fortune. Was he using his beautiful, innocent children as bait? The thought made her feel sick. She needed answers, and she knew she wouldn't get them from Jax. She had to go around him. She called Martha Caldwell at the diner. "Martha, it's Elena. I have a strange question for you." She tried to keep her voice light. "You know everything that goes on in this town. You mentioned that Jax Malloy's wife died during that bad blizzard a couple of years back. Do you remember her name?" There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Sarah, I believe," Martha said, her voice a little hesitant. "Yes, Sarah Malloy. A terrible tragedy. And you said he came from up north, right? Montana?" Another pause, longer this time. Martha was a gossip, but she wasn't cruel. She was picking up on the tension in Elena's voice. "That's the story he told, dear. Why all the questions? Is everything all right with the barn repairs?" "Everything's fine," Elena lied smoothly. "Just making conversation. He's a quiet man. Hard to get to know." "That he is," Martha agreed, but her tone was wary. She knew there was more to this call. "Listen, Elena, some stories in a small town. Sometimes they're just stories. Simpler versions of a complicated truth. You understand?" It wasn't an answer. It was a warning. After she hung up, Elena knew what she had to do. Dusty Fork was a closed loop of gossip and speculation. She needed facts. Cold, hard, undeniable facts. She waited until the boys were down for their afternoon nap. She scribbled a hasty note for Jax, ran into town for an errand, be back soon, and left it on the kitchen table. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely write. She didn't drive to Dusty Fork. She drove in the opposite direction, toward the county seat in Williamson, an hour away. The whole way there, her mind raced. S. Walker, Miller's Creek Bridge, Liam Walker. It was all a tangled mess of secrets, and she felt like if she pulled on one more thread, her entire life would unravel. The Williamson County Courthouse was an imposing brick building that smelled of old paper and floor wax. Elelenina walked with a purpose she didn't feel, her heart hammering against her ribs. She went to the records office. The clerk, a woman with a severe bun and glasses perched on her nose, looked at her with bored disinterest. "I'd like to look up some public records, please," Elelenina said, her voice small in the cavernous room. "Which ones?" the clerk asked without looking up. "Marriage records first." Her mouth was dry. "For Jasper Malloy and Sarah Malloy, approximately 2 to 3 years ago." The clerk typed for a few minutes, the clicking of the keys echoing in the silence. Then she shook her head. Nothing. No Jasper Malloy married to a Sarah anything in this county. "Could you try Sarah Walker?" Elelenina asked, her voice barely a whisper. More typing. Another shake of the head. "Nope, no Sarah Walker either." Ice slid down Elelenina's spine. "No marriage license. Maybe they were married in Montana before they came here. A plausible explanation." "Okay," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "How about a death certificate? For Sarah Malloy. It would have been about 2.5 years ago, during the big blizzard in January." The clerk's fingers flew across the keyboard again. She frowned, typed some more. Finally, she turned her screen toward Elelenina. There were 3 deaths recorded in the county that month. An elderly man from a heart attack, a car accident on the interstate, and a Jane Doe. A Jane Doe? Unidentified female, found in a car on a service road out near Miller's Creek. Coroner ruled it a suicide. Miller's Creek, the same place Henry was supposed to meet S. Walker. Elelenina felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. Was there a blizzard that week? The clerk shrugged. "Don't recall, but I can tell you the date of death was recorded as January 18th. Let's see." She clicked a few more times. "Weather records show it was clear and cold that whole week. No snow at all." The story was a lie, a complete fabrication. The town had been told Sarah Malloy died in a blizzard, but there was no blizzard. There was only a Jane Doe who had died alone in her car. Elelenina's heart was pounding so hard she thought it might burst. One last record, the one she was most afraid to see. "Birth certificates," she said, her voice cracking. "For Luke and Liam, last name Malloy, born about 2.5 years ago." The clerk's search was quick. Nothing. No births registered to a Jasper Malloy. Elelenina took a deep, shuddering breath. Try, the last name Walker. The clerk typed in the name. A record instantly popped up on the screen. The clerk turned it for her to see. There it was, in stark black and white. A birth certificate, filed at Williamson County Hospital, for twin boys, Luke Walker and Liam Walker, born on July 10th, 5 days before Henry died. Elelenina's eyes scanned down the form, past the date, past the weight and length, down to the boxes for the parents' names. Mother, Sarah Jane Walker. Her eyes jumped to the next box, the one she had been dreading. Father. The name printed there wasn't Jasper. It wasn't a blank space. It was a name she knew as well as her own. Henry Pike. The world went white. The drive home was a blur. The sturdy Texas landscape, the familiar turns in the road, it all looked alien, like a foreign country. Elelenina drove on pure instinct, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles were white. Henry. Her Henry. The man she had loved for 27 years. The man whose grief had been her constant companion for 3. The man she thought she knew better than she knew herself. He had lived a double life. He had a mistress, a woman named Sarah Walker, and he had fathered her children, twins. The boys playing in her house, the boys she had fallen in love with, were not the orphans of a tragic accident. They were her husband's sons, her stepsons. The betrayal was a physical thing, a shard of ice in her chest that radiated a freezing, numbing pain. Every memory she had of Henry was now tainted, a lie. Their quiet evenings together, his gentle hands, his whispered promises that she was enough. All of it, a performance. While he was holding her, was he thinking of his other woman, his other life, his sons? The questions were a swarm of angry bees in her head. And then there was Jax. Who was he? If he wasn't the boy's father, then what was he? A con man? A kidnapper who had stumbled upon 2 abandoned children and was using them to stake a claim on the Pike farm? The fear was so intense it made her nauseous. The boys were in her house right now with this man, this liar. She slammed on the brakes, her truck skidding to a halt in the middle of the dusty road. She had to go back. She had to get the boys. She had to call the sheriff. But what would she tell him? That her dead husband had a secret family, and the man raising them is an imposter. They would think she was a crazy, grieving widow. She took a deep breath, forcing the panic down. She needed to be smart. She needed to confront him. She needed the whole truth before she did anything else. When she pulled into her driveway, the house looked peaceful, just as she'd left it. But now it felt sinister, a stage for a play where she was the only one who didn't know her lines. She walked in the back door. The house was quiet, too quiet. "Jax!" she called out, her voice trembling. No answer. "Luke? Liam?" Her heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She ran through the kitchen into the living room. Empty. She flew up the stairs, her feet barely touching the steps. She threw open the door to the guest room where the boys napped. The room was empty. The small beds were neatly made. They were gone. A raw, primal scream tore from her throat. She had been a fool. A blind, sentimental fool. While she was at the courthouse uncovering his lies, he had packed up the boys and fled. He had taken her husband's sons. She stumbled back down the stairs, her mind reeling. She had to call Sheriff Brody. She reached for the phone on the kitchen wall, her fingers fumbling with the receiver. And that's when she saw it. On the kitchen table, where she had left her note, there was a single piece of paper, and resting on top of it was the small, tarnished brass key. Her hand shook as she picked it up. The note was from Jax, his handwriting surprisingly neat. "Elena, I know you went to Williamson. I know you know. I'm not who you think I am, but I'm not a bad man. The boys are safe. They are where they belong. If you want the real truth, the whole truth, use the key. It opens the old footlocker in the back of Henry's closet. I'm sorry for the lies. I was just trying to protect them." Jax, Henry's closet, a place she hadn't been able to bring herself to clean out. It was still filled with his clothes, his boots, the smell of him. She clutched the key in her hand and ran back up the stairs. She threw open the door to their bedroom, her bedroom now, and went to the closet. In the back, behind a row of his flannel shirts, was the old, beat-up metal footlocker he'd had since his army days. She had never known it to be locked. The brass key slid into the lock. It turned with a rusty click. She lifted the heavy lid. The contents were not what she expected. There were no hidden treasures, no stacks of cash. There was just a thick stack of letters tied with a faded blue ribbon, and a photograph. She picked up the photo. It was of a young woman with a bright, hopeful smile and the same dark, serious eyes as Luke and Liam. She was beautiful. It was Sarah Walker, and standing next to her, his arm wrapped tightly around her waist, was her brother. It was Jax. He looked younger, happier, but it was undeniably him. Her mind struggled to piece it together. He was Sarah's brother. He was the boy's uncle. She untied the ribbon and picked up the first letter. The handwriting was her husband's. The date was from 4 years ago. My dearest Sarah, I can't stop thinking about our conversation. You've brought a light back into my life that I thought was gone forever. I know the situation is complicated. I know I have obligations, but what I feel for you is real. I promise you, I will find a way for us to be together. I will make things right. All my love, H. Elelenina sank to the floor, the letter fluttering from her fingers. She read through them one by one, a chronicle of a 4-year affair, a story of secret meetings at Miller's Creek Bridge, of whispered promises, of a love that was passionate and real and utterly devastating. Henry had loved this woman. He had planned to leave Elelenina for her. The last letter was different. It was written in a frantic, messy scrawl. The date was July 12th, 3 days before he died. Sarah, my love, you told me about the babies. Twins. I can't believe it. I'm going to be a father. This changes everything. No more waiting, no more hiding. I'm telling Elelenina, I'm ending it. I'll come to you on the 15th, and we will start our life together. All of us, I promise. This is our beginning. Yours forever, Henry. But it wasn't a beginning. It was an end. He never made it to that meeting at the bridge. His heart gave out in the barn loft before he could ever tell Elelenina the truth, before he could ever claim his sons. He died, leaving 2 women in the wreckage of his promises. Elelenina sat there on the floor, surrounded by the evidence of her husband's betrayal, and she didn't feel anger. She just felt a profound, bottomless sorrow. For Henry, who had been trapped between 2 lives. For Sarah, who had been left alone and pregnant with a secret she couldn't share. For herself. For the 27 years of lies she had unknowingly lived. And for the 2 little boys who had lost their father before they ever knew him. She finally understood. Jax, or whatever his real name was, hadn't come here to con her. He had come here on a mission. A desperate, heartbreaking pilgrimage. She looked at the last item in the box. It was a single, folded newspaper clipping. A small obituary from the Williamson County Chronicle, dated 1.5 years ago. Sarah Jane Walker, 26, passed away on January 18th. A beloved daughter and sister, she is survived by her brother, Jason Walker, and her infant sons, Luke and Liam. Jason Walker, not Jasper Malloy. The cause of death wasn't mentioned. But Elelenina knew. The Jane Doe in the car at Miller's Creek. The place where she was supposed to start her new life with Henry. The place where her dreams had died. The story of the blizzard wasn't just a lie to cover up a secret affair. It was a lie to cover up a suicide. The truth hit Elelenina with the force of a physical blow. Sarah Walker, abandoned by her lover, ostracized by the town for being an unwed mother, had fallen into a despair so deep she couldn't find her way out. And her brother, Jason, had been left to pick up the pieces. He had changed his name, invented a story, and moved his orphaned nephews to the one place he knew they had a connection to. He brought them to Dusty Fork, to be near their father's legacy. He had taken the job fixing the barn not for the money, but for a chance to get close, to see the farm that should have been theirs, to somehow fulfill the broken promise his sister had died for. He hadn't run away with the boys. He had brought them home. The note said they were where they belong. There was only one other place that could mean. Elelenina grabbed the truck keys and ran. She didn't drive toward town or toward the Henderson place. She drove east, toward the small, windswept cemetery on the hill where 4 generations of Pikes were buried. She saw his truck parked by the old iron gate. She found them standing in front of Henry's grave. Jason, she would call him Jason now, was holding Liam in his arms. Luke was standing beside him, his small hand clutching a fistful of wildflowers he must have picked from the side of the road. The setting sun cast long shadows across the tombstones. It was quiet, peaceful. Jason turned as she approached. There were no more lies in his eyes, just a deep, weary sadness that mirrored her own. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice quiet. "I never meant for you to find out this way. I never meant to hurt you." "You should have told me," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the two boys, who were looking at their father's tombstone with a solemn curiosity. "How?" he asked, a bitter laugh escaping his lips. "How do you walk up to a grieving widow and say, 'Excuse me, my sister was your husband's mistress, and these are his illegitimate children. He was going to leave you for us, but he died first. Oh, and by the way, my sister killed herself because he broke his promise.' There's no easy way to tell that story, Elilena." He was right, there wasn't. She walked closer, stopping beside him. She looked down at the granite headstone. Henry Pike, beloved husband. The words felt hollow now, incomplete. "They look like him," she said softly. "Around the eyes?" "They do," Jason agreed. "Sarah said the same thing. It's why I couldn't stay away. I look at them, and I see him, and I see her. I made her a promise before she died. I promised I would make sure they were taken care of. That they would know who their father was. That they would get what was rightfully theirs." He looked around at the vast expanse of the Pike farm, stretching out below the cemetery hill. This was supposed to be theirs. Luke walked over to Elilena and tugged on her hand. "Sad?" he asked, his little face etched with concern. She knelt down and pulled him into a fierce hug, burying her face in his soft blonde hair. The tears she had been holding back for 3 years finally came, hot and silent. They weren't just tears for Henry's betrayal, or for her lost years. They were tears for Sarah, for Jason, and for these 2 innocent boys caught in the middle of a tragedy they would never understand. "Yes, sweetie," she whispered into his hair. "I'm sad, but I'm also happy. I'm happy you're here." She looked up at Jason, her eyes meeting his over Luke's head. In that moment, they weren't strangers bound by a web of lies. They were the only 2 people on Earth who understood the full weight of this story. They were family. A strange, broken, complicated family, but family nonetheless. "What happens now?" Jason asked, his voice raw. Elilena stood up, taking Luke's hand in one of hers and reaching for Liam, who was still in Jason's arms. Jason let her take him, his body warm and trusting against hers. "Now," she said, her voice filled with a certainty that surprised them both. "Now, you stop being Jasper Malloy, and these boys stop being walkers." She looked from the grave to the farmhouse in the distance, to the barn that was slowly being brought back to life. "They are Pike boys," she said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "And it's time they came home. For good." The barn wasn't just a monument to what was lost anymore. It became a promise of what could be built. Jason Walker, no longer hiding behind a false name, finished the repairs. But he didn't just fix the rotten loft. He rebuilt it. With Elilena's help, they transformed the cavernous old structure. They put in new stalls for horses they planned to buy. They built a workshop for Jason and a huge open space where the boys could play on rainy days. They worked side by side, 2 people bonded by a shared complicated grief and a fierce protective love for 2 little boys. They didn't talk much about the past. There was no need. It lived in the quiet spaces between them, in the shared glances over the dinner table, in the way Jason's hand would sometimes brush hers as they worked. It wasn't a romance. It was something deeper, more elemental. It was partnership. It was family. Elilena went to a lawyer in Williamson and began the legal process. It was messy and complicated, but she was relentless. She formally adopted Luke and Liam, giving them the Pike name that was their birthright. The silence in the farmhouse was gone forever, replaced by the constant, joyous chaos of 2 growing boys. The echoes of Henry's ghost were replaced by the sound of his son's laughter. One evening, months later, the 4 of them were sitting on the newly repaired front porch, watching the sun set over the Texas prairie. The sky was a blaze of orange and pink. Luke and Liam were chasing fireflies in the yard, their jars blinking in the twilight. "He would have loved them," Elilena said softly, not looking at Jason, but at the boys. "I know," Jason said, his voice quiet beside her. He did. In his own flawed way, he did. Elena finally allowed herself to believe it. Henry had made a terrible mistake. He had broken her heart and his promises, but he had also given her the one thing she had always wanted. He had given her these boys. She looked at Jason. The haunted look was gone from his eyes, replaced by a quiet peace. He was no longer just the boys' uncle. He was their father, in every way that mattered. And she was their mother, the hole in her heart, the one that had been carved out by years of loss and loneliness, was full. It wasn't the life she had planned. It was messy and complicated, and born from a painful truth. But it was her life. And for the first time in a very long time, it was beautiful. Sometimes the deepest betrayals can lead to the most profound love, and family isn't about the secrets we keep, but about the truths we choose to build a future on. If you believe that family is more than just blood, and that second chances are what make us human, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Because the stories we share here are all about the ties that truly and unexpectedly bind us together.